It was winter, and the school season was about to end to give way to the long-awaited Christmas holidays. Liam, like all the children in his class, couldn't contain his excitement and nerves to know what Santa Claus would give him that year. The news had recently broken that Santa had gotten married and that he shared the task of bringing gifts to all the children in the world with his wife, Mrs. Claus. Everyone was talking excitedly about the toys they wanted to ask their wife for. Everyone except Robert, who had completely changed his attitude since last Christmas. Robert had lived in an orphanage since his parents abandoned him on Christmas Eve the previous year. He firmly maintained that his parents would never have left him alone, and that Mrs. Claus had punished him for his bad behavior by taking his parents away from him. Liam had always been intrigued by what had happened to Robert and finally dared to ask because no one else seemed interested. Robert, looking at the ground with a dissatisfied expression, confessed that Mrs. Claus was not the one everyone thought she was. He claimed to know important secrets, but no one was willing to listen to him. He expressed his hope that no other child would have to experience what had happened to him, and hoped that one day the truth would come out and Santa's wife would be arrested. Liam felt a little uncomfortable and wanted to end the conversation, which seemed a bit delirious. He expressed his sadness for everything Robert had experienced and wished him a happy holiday. Afterwards, he went to where they had the coats to go home. Before he left, Robert stopped him by grabbing his hand. He fixed his eyes intensely on him and said, "Be a good boy." Liam stood still for a few seconds, pondering, and finally nodded his head. His friend let go of his hand and turned his gaze to the ground. For Liam, Christmas represented his favorite times. Although summer had its fun with longer vacations and warm weather to enjoy the beach, Liam had a special affection for Christmas, as it was the time when he could finally reunite with his father. The man spent most of the year working in Europe, which left the little boy living a lot of time alone with his mother. When the woman was at work, he sometimes had to stay with his grandmother, who lived a short distance from their house. That day, at the end of classes, his father had just arrived and was waiting for him with open arms at the school door. Liam couldn't wait to go to the park to play, like they used to do every Friday after school. However, his father came up with the idea of taking advantage of the day to go to the mall and do some Christmas shopping. Liam wasn't thrilled with the idea and started screaming and crying, hoping they would change their minds. His parents told him that it was necessary to make those purchases because they needed some things for Christmas dinner. And there he could have fun choosing decorations for the tree. The boy, angry, expressed his hatred towards Christmas and towards them for forcing him to go shopping. The mother, with an angry expression, scolded him for his words and asked him to apologize to both her and his father. However, Liam, crossing his arms and without saying a word, simply got into the car in silence. When they arrived at the mall, it was decorated with Christmas lights and decorations. In the distance, a long line of children could be seen stretching from the main entrance. It was Santa Claus and his wife, who were sitting on two majestic thrones, posing for photos with the little ones and allowing them to sit on their laps to express their wishes for Christmas gifts. Liam's mother changed her angry expression, tried to calm the situation, and proposed to Liam that they could go visit Santa Claus together. The little boy quickly changed his attitude and nodded. He was eager to tell Santa that he wanted the remote control car he had been eyeing in the toy store for months. The line was organized in a unique way until it reached the thrones, where it was then divided into two. Some sat with Santa Claus and others with Mrs. Claus. Liam was nervous as ever. He longed for it to be his turn to sit on Santa's lap, because throughout his life he had asked him for gifts and he had always brought him everything he wanted. Unfortunately, it was Mrs. Claus' turn. He remained motionless, waiting for another child to decide to go with her. However, Mrs. Claus began calling him and beckoning him to come closer. His mother gently nudged him forward and assured him that he shouldn't be afraid, that it was okay to make a change. Although he was not entirely happy with the idea, Liam approached timidly. Once sitting on her lap, Mrs. Claus commented that he looked like a very good boy. She asked him to smile for the photo and managed to get a laugh with some tickles on his belly. The mother took advantage of the moment to take the photo and mentioned, "Well, today wasn't his best behaved day, was it?" As she let out a small smile and winked at her son. Liam also gave a small laugh and lowered his head. After this, Mrs. Claus's face suddenly changed expression. She looked at the boy and asked if that was true. He looked at his parents and then looked down, nodding sheepishly. Then Mrs. Claus warned him that if he wasn't good to his parents, he didn't deserve to have them, and she would deprive him of them and would only give him coal. Liam thought for a moment and asked, "Why charcoal?" At that moment, his father intervened and explained that he had heard of that tradition in other places in the world where children also received gifts from 3 men riding camels at Christmas. These 3 men were known as the 3 wise men, and children who misbehaved were given coal instead of toys. After leaving there, Liam realized that he hadn't even had a chance to tell Mrs. Claus what he wanted for Christmas. However, he didn't want to return because he hadn't liked that lady at all. The Christmas holidays had only begun and they were already as exciting and wonderful as he had wanted them to be. The little boy delighted in sweets, especially those that his grandmother prepared, such as the elf-shaped cookies that she used to make during the Christmas season. Additionally, he enjoyed Christmas movie nights with his parents, a time he looked forward to all year long to share with his family. The day before Christmas, Liam and his parents dedicated themselves to decorating the tree, the house, and preparing dinner. Several relatives had gone to spend the night with them, and he had had a great time playing with his cousins. The atmosphere was full of laughter and joy until it was time to go to bed. They said goodbye to the family members who were returning home to sleep while the magic of Christmas took place. Liam's parents accompanied the little boy to his room, but he complained. He didn't want to leave yet because this was one of the happiest nights of the year and he never wanted it to end. His parents reminded him that he should go to bed early, otherwise Santa Claus and his wife would not be able to give him his presents that night. The parents went up the stairs to their bedrooms, but as they ascended, Liam noticed a shadow crossing quickly. He ran down the stairs to find out what he had seen, but found no trace. Suddenly, he saw a red shadow through the window again. He stared at the glass until he could make out the face of Mrs. Claus, who gave him a wicked smile and placed a finger on her lips, signaling him to remain silent. Terrified, Liam screamed for his parents to come down, but when they came running and the little boy pointed in the window, there was nothing there. Liam's parents insisted that it was too late to play and ordered him to go to sleep. The little boy obeyed and got under the covers quickly. He was sweating and couldn't get Mrs. Claus's evil gaze out of his head. He tossed and turned in bed, overwhelmed by his thoughts, until he finally fell asleep, exhausted by fatigue. The next morning, Liam woke up and ran up. The day didn't frighten him like the night. He decided to go to his parents' room, although something seemed strange to him. Usually, his parents were the ones who woke him up because they always had their coffee very early. But that day had not been like that. When he opened the door to his parents' room, he realized they weren't there. Worry began to invade him, and he quickly went out into the hallway. But there, he smelled the aroma of the freshly brewed coffee that his mother prepared every morning, which gave him some peace of mind. He calmly descended the stairs, expecting to find his parents in the kitchen, but to his surprise, there was no one. Just 2 cups of coffee on the counter. It seemed strange to him, but he didn't get too upset. He remembered that sometimes they went to look for his grandmother at her house so that she could join the celebration and open the gifts together. When he reached the tree, he got another big surprise. There was only one gift. Liam, feeling sad, waited for his parents to return before opening it. He knew he hadn't been a bad child. He just had his moments of temper tantrums like anyone else. After waiting patiently for 2 long hours with no one showing up, curiosity began to agitate Liam. He thought that the gift laying under the tree might be the only thing that Santa Claus or his wife had left him. Without further delay, he tore the wrapping paper and found that there were only a few pieces of coal inside. Liam burst into tears, overwhelmed by the thought that, just as Mrs. Claus at the mall had warned, he only deserved coal and she had taken his parents. He had never left home alone, much less left his street. However, he felt desperate and decided to walk to his grandmother's house. She lived about a 20-minute walk away, and he knew the way from going there many times with his parents. In his mind, he was recreating everything he would say to them for giving him that scare and leaving him alone on such a special day. However, when he got there, he didn't find anyone either. It seemed that his grandmother wasn't at home, because she didn't answer it when he pressed the doorbell, and his parents' car wasn't in sight either. With a feeling of desolation, Liam returned home and began walking back. Suddenly, the words of that boy from school, Robert, flooded his mind. He changed his course and headed towards the orphanage. He was the only person who could have information about what had happened. When he got there, the workers informed him that Robert had escaped days ago and that they didn't know his whereabouts. Liam, desperate, needed some clue to know where he was. So he decided to make up an excuse to get the workers to let him into his room. He told them that Robert had kept a book of his from school and that he needed it to be able to do his vacation homework. He said it would only take him a minute to go get it because he knew where he kept it. In that way, the workers allowed him to go. When he entered the room, he noticed that his friend's mattress was raised slightly. He approached and discovered his diary. In it, Robert wrote that he had finally discovered Mrs. Claus's whereabouts and had drawn a map pointing to an entrance to a cave in the woods behind Liam's house. The boy ran at full speed back to his house and headed to the back of his garden. There, he looked closely at the ground and noticed some fine wheel tracks heading towards the forest. Following the markings, he reached the entrance to the cave that Robert had marked in his drawing and entered without a second thought. Following the route, Liam entered a series of underground galleries, and at the end of the path, he came across a wooden cart that explained the marks on the ground. Next to it, there was a small container that contained his parents' belongings, as well as other objects that were unknown to him. He advanced with caution and came across a horrifying scene. Mrs. Claus was leading an army of elves who were mutilating the people trapped in that place, cutting off their fingers and toes. The amputated fingers were thrown into a burning oven. The rest of the bodies were pierced by hooks and hung by chains to serve as food for Santa's reindeer. There was nothing cute or funny about reindeer. They had sharp teeth, red eyes, and blood-stained snouts. With their mouths, they tore the skin of the corpses and of those who had not yet died, but who screamed in pain while the fierce animals dismembered their intestines without mercy. Mrs. Claus supervised the elves, assigning tasks and deciding where to place victims, while laughing from a high throne in the cave. The elves sung as they threw people's fingers into the oven. In the middle of this nightmare, one of the elves looked towards where Liam was. The little boy quickly escaped in search of a place to hide. When he thought he was safe, he looked at what appeared to be the end of the oven, watching the charred pieces of fingers fall into a box. The boy burst into tears again and ran outside. He arrived home feeling like he had nowhere to go. It was then that he realized that the box he had found under the tree was the same one at the end of the oven, and that the blocks of charcoal were the charred remains of his parents' fingers. Desperate, he ran back to the orphanage to tell what he had seen. However, when they returned to look for the cave, it had disappeared. Robert's diary had fallen during his escape, and there was no longer a trace of the footprints on the ground. Eventually, Liam ended up living in the orphanage. In class, he sat in the place Robert usually occupied, looking down like the previous boy used to do. He could no longer look at his grandmother's cookies in the shape of elves without remembering them singing while committing such atrocities. He couldn't help but think that Mrs. Claus was a murderer. She remained undiscovered and was idolized by everyone while he knew the truth of what happened. Since then, he never believed in Christmas again.
As every December, all the houses in the village were decorated with thousands of ornaments. Licks was a peculiar place. Christmas was sacred there, a time that no one could ignore. And what all the neighbors liked the most was the decoration contest. Except for 3 or 4 houses, all of them were very involved. They changed every year the designs and decorations, and they tried to be the best. That year there were 3 new neighbors in town, so the mayor ran to their houses to tell them about the local traditions. 2 of the families agreed to participate in the contest willingly. They said they probably wouldn't be up to the task, but they would try. The 3rd family did not answer the door the first 2 times the mayor came to their house. They were inside because he himself could see the light in the living room, but either they didn't hear the doorbell or they didn't want to open. He didn't give up and tried one last time. This time, they did open the door, but when he told them the story, the father of the family said that they didn't have time for such games. They would put a Christmas tree in the garden and nothing else. But upon seeing it, the mayor had a better idea. Every year when the judges go around the neighborhood looking for the best decorations, they're accompanied by a Santa Claus. This way, they take advantage of the visit to give some presents to the little ones. The new neighbor was older and had a big belly, so he was the perfect one to carry out that task. So, when he was about to leave the family plot, he turned around and told the gentleman that he had one last request. He proposed him to be the Santa Claus for the holidays. The man said he would think about it, and a couple of days later, he accepted the proposal. It was the beginning of December, so in those days, all the houses started to have their decorations. The deadline was until the 15th. If any house was left undecorated on that day, it would not be entered in the contest. But nobody waited for that date. The excitement was such that the first week, all the houses were perfectly decorated. The rules of the competition were as follows. 3 judges accompanied Santa Claus to evaluate the houses. They determined the 3 best and the 3 worst. The best received shopping vouchers of different values to spend in local stores, in addition to the plaques certifying them as winners. In fact, the latter was what the neighbors wanted most. They didn't care about the money. The 3 worst ones would have to be in charge of organizing the Christmas meal for the most needy of the town. They would also distribute clothes and gifts to the children at the orphanage. These were things that most of them were happy to do, so it was hardly a punishment for anyone. Santa Claus would be very busy during those days, as he was the emblem of the festivities and would have many appointments. This worried the mayor, who was afraid that the new neighbor would not fulfill his commitments or would leave them hanging in the middle of Christmas. That's why they looked for a substitute Santa Claus, a lifelong gentleman from the village. With everything ready, the 15th arrived faster than they expected. The town was a veritable Christmas museum, with lights and themed figurines everywhere. And even the new neighbors had come up with some fantastic decorations. During the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, the judges and Santa Claus would visit the houses. They always divided the city by zones. They would start with the north and go clockwise, with the west being the last part visited. The first day, the new Santa Claus was a bit awkward. They had to encourage him several times to interact more with the children and act more effusively. He didn't seem to like Christmas very much, but little by little he got into the role. The houses in the northern area were the ones with the most spending power, and they always made their presence felt in terms of decorations and lights. That doesn't mean they always won, but you could tell they were shelling out a lot of money for the competition. Santa Claus was really impressed with those decorations. He'd never seen anything like it. The jury took note, and everything went smoothly. On the second day, as they were starting their tour of the east side, an alarm caused the procession to stop dead in its tracks. Mr. Carrick, who had been the town's bank manager for 30 years, was missing. He was a man of few words, but very well known and helpful. He lived in one of the houses on the north side, where the judges and Santa Claus had been the day before. This brought the visit to a standstill for a few hours. The whole town gathered in the municipal hall to decide what to do. In the end, they decided that they would take turns participating in the search tasks, and the contest would run its course. Some neighbors were against this option. They understood that the logical thing to do was to paralyze everything in order to search for the missing person. But the power of Christmas and the children's illusion was stronger, and they ended up continuing with the celebration. Nevertheless, the whole village turned to the search for Mr. Carrick. They formed groups and divided up all the territories near the houses. But nothing. There seemed to be no trace of him since he had left his work the day before. The competition committee hurried the pace during day 2. These houses were more austere. It was the old part of town, but that also gave it more charm, because they were old but well-kept facades. The stamp transported to the past, and that especially pleased Santa Claus, who even remembered his childhood, something he had not thought about for a long time. At the end of the day, the bank manager still hadn't shown up. His family was very worried. They were convinced that he would never leave of his own free will, so they knew that something bad had happened to him. And everything got worse on the second day when the apothecary disappeared. James was a man in his 50s who ran the family pharmacy in the old town. It was a lifelong business, and they lived in one of the oldest houses in town. He had gone out for the night with his dog and had not returned home. The dog had returned to the door of the house at about 3 a.m. The apothecary's wife, who had been a member of the family for a long time, had been there. The apothecary's wife, who had fallen asleep hours earlier, gave the alarm. Nothing like this had ever happened before. 2 disappearances in 2 days, and at Christmas. The police had to send reinforcements to coordinate the 2 search operations, and the mayor decided to continue with everything as it was. So, on the 3rd day, some judges who thought more about what was happening than about visiting houses and Santa Claus went out to analyze more Christmas decorations. The atmosphere in the streets was completely different. There were hardly any people in the houses, because most of them were out looking for the missing. They were always greeted by children with their mother or father, who in the end were also unaware of the terrible situation that was taking place there. Zone 3, the southern one, was the most industrial zone. There were car workshops, blacksmith shops, and many other businesses. The houses tended to be of relatively new construction and humble. Here it was striking how the business owners, mostly men, decorated their workshops. It seemed hard to believe that an agricultural feed mill could be tender and Christmassy, but yes, it was possible. They finished at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and the judges joined the search operation for the banker and the apothecary. Santa Claus claimed he could not because he had to go and take care of his wife. It was the first time he had spoken about her. Apparently, she had major psychological problems and needed help for everything. The search for the missing persons was still fruitless, and on the 4th day, the nightmare was even worse. Carlos's wife, the owner of a car repair shop, reported him missing in the morning. He had gone out to take out the garbage and had not returned. Terror began to spread. People were afraid to go out on the street. It was clear that something strange was going on. So, the mayor called together the neighbors in the contest group and told them that the best thing to do was call the whole thing off. A large number of neighbors agreed, but others said it wasn't fair, that only one area was left unchecked. But the judges didn't want to go along with it either, preferring to help with the search rather than continue analyzing Christmas decorations. Then Santa Claus raised his hand and offered to do the last tour by himself. That way he would take pictures and notes of the decorations, and the children in that area would not miss seeing him. Most of them thought it was a good idea. They selected 2 city employees to accompany him, and he headed for the 4th zone, the west. Meanwhile, the police had been trying to figure out what was going on for 3 days. The disappearances were the strangest, and then one of them noticed something. The 3 missing people belonged to 3 different areas of the city, and those areas coincided with the route of the pageant procession. It was then that they interviewed the judges, who said that they had not observed anything unusual on the route. For their part, the 3 had an alibi, because they had been helping to decorate the social club. But what about Santa Claus? Nobody knew anything about his life. At that moment, he was touring the West, an area of new housing, where most of the young married couples of the area lived. It was an area of townhouses and a lot of children. Santa Claus had quite demanding work to do, and the police followed him closely. When they finished, they saw him enter his house, and indeed, through the glass, they could see a woman. He was caressing her face and feeding her. But in an hour, the lights in the house went out, and he went out to a shed in the back. He checked to make sure no one was following him, loaded something into his truck, and set off. He was indeed heading west. Once there, he drove into the park and turned off the engine. They saw him get out with something in his hand, but they couldn't see what it was. And suddenly it happened. A man was out for a walk with his 2 dogs, and out of nowhere, the man who was playing Santa Claus appeared and stabbed him in the neck. At that moment, the police came out of hiding and managed to catch him. What he was holding in his hand was a syringe. The young man was taken to the hospital, and Santa Claus to the police station. It was clear that he was responsible for the disappearances, so now he had to find out where those people were. But he didn't want to talk about it, so the police handcuffed him and took him home. There they found his wife, who looked around nervously but did not answer anything they asked her. The house was full of pictures of a little girl. She was very blonde and had big blue eyes. The woman kept looking at her as if she was the answer to everything. And indeed it was. That was their daughter, Miranda. She had been murdered by a neighbor when she was only 10 years old, so the police thought it might be related to the disappearances. They went back to question the man and asked directly about his daughter. That caused him to completely break down. He cried inconsolably and eventually confessed. He had chosen the victims during the contest visits. All the men selected had things in common with his daughter's killer, but the most important thing was missing. Where were they? Santa Claus confessed that the first two had been murdered, and that was not the worst of it. He had butchered them because, according to him, they were offerings for his daughter's soul. He would remove body parts and scatter them in the cemetery where the little girl's remains were. That was his way of letting her know that he was avenging her. The third missing person was found alive. He was in a cabin in the middle of the forest, bound hand and foot, and in a very serious condition. Apparently, Santa Claus was wounding them so that they would bleed to death. This is how his little girl had also died. The man was sent to prison, and his wife to a mental health clinic. And the town was never the same again. The decorating competition was suspended, and people stopped believing a little in Christmas.
Kevin and his friends were in a rented house for their summer vacation. They were all 15 years old, and it was the first time they had taken a trip together. After dinner, Margot suggested a game of hide and seek. Since they didn't know the house, it might be fun to find a good hiding place in that place. Almost everyone agreed, but Peter insisted on finding another game. He didn't feel comfortable hiding there. The guys, far from abandoning the subject, asked him why. The young man hesitated for a moment before replying, and then said, "Years ago, I was in a house where a girl died. She was playing hide and seek with her friends in a house she didn't know. To make it more difficult, they turned off all the lights and played in the dark. The girl opened a door, thinking that on the other side was a bedroom, but it was a driveway that led to a basement, with stairs just past the door. Not seeing them, she fell down and died after breaking her neck." The group of friends froze. Then, Margot broke the silence by asking him if he knew this girl. Peter shook his head, but assured her that he had experienced something much worse. Suddenly, his upset face changed completely, and with a smile, he asked them if they knew Smee's game. The name came from It's Me. Everyone looked at him curiously, and then the young man explained what it was. Each player receives a sheet of paper. All sheets except one are blank. The sheet that has text has the word Smee written on it. Nobody knows who Smee is, except the one who's touched it. Then the lights go out, and Smee quietly leaves the room and hides. After counting to 20, the others try to look for him, but of course they don't know who they're looking for in the dark. So when one player meets another, they must challenge them by saying Smee. If the other person isn't the one you're looking for either, he should reply Smee too, and continue searching. However, the real Smee doesn't respond when someone challenges him. If someone finds him, the player will remain silent by his side, and they must be discovered by a third player. This one, when he finds them, will not receive an answer either, and will join the first two. The game continues like this until all the players are in the same place, and the last one to find Smee has to pay a pledge. Kevin thought it was a very fun game. He asked his friend if he had ever played before, to which Peter replied that he did it in the house where that girl had broken her neck. Margot told everyone in the group to sit on the floor and encouraged Peter to tell the story. They were all impatient to find out what had happened that day that made their friends so afraid to play hide and seek. Peter also sat down on the ground and began his story. 2 years ago, my parents' best friends invited us to spend Christmas with them and their children. They live 6 hours by car from here, in a big but old house, with many corridors and stairs. It was easy to get lost in that mansion. That Christmas, we were not the only guests. They had also summoned other families. There were plenty of rooms for everyone. When we entered, everyone had already arrived, and the only people I knew were the children of my parents' friends. So they were introducing me to others. In total, we were 12 young people. The older ones insisted that it was time to have dinner, that later we could chat and play, and in the rush I couldn't introduce myself to everyone. Maybe that's why I didn't hear the name of a tall and pretty girl with dark hair. She seemed cold but very intelligent. She didn't seem all that friendly, but she seemed very interesting. After dinner, one of the homeowner's daughters, Sarah, suggested playing Smee. She explained the rules of the game to us, and when we were about to start, her father approached us to warn us about the door that gave access to the basement, and told us the story of the girl who had broken her neck there. We all promised to be careful and did not go near that door. The older ones stayed in the living room with the light on, and we went to the kitchen. From there, we would start the game. The rest of the house was dark. We prepared 12 pieces of paper. 11 were blank, and one had SME written on it. Then Sarah mixed them up and distributed them. I looked at the paper that had touched me. It was blank. A moment later, all the lights went out. The person who received the paper with SME had to hide, and in the dark, I heard someone sneaking towards the door. After counting to 20 in our minds, someone blew a whistle and we ran to the door. For 10 minutes, we were all running up and down, in and out of rooms, challenging each other and responding, "SME, SME." After a while, the noise calmed down, so I assumed that someone had already found the hidden person. Then I found a group of people sitting on some narrow stairs. I challenged them and received no response. So, SME was there. I quickly joined the group. At that moment, 2 more players arrived. Everyone was rushing so as not to be the losers, and just as Sarah's older brother Arthur was the last to meet us, he asked out loud if we were all here. He lit a match and began to count. 10, 11, 12, 13. Then he laughed. "How are we going to be 13? Is there one more?" The match went out and he lit another. He counted again in the gloom, and when he got to it, he renumbered 13 people. The boys began to make fun of the young man, telling him that he didn't know how to count. Then in the middle of the stairs, a girl spoke nervously. Who was sitting 2 steps above me? No one answered, but suddenly a cold finger seemed to touch us all. We fell silent, and suddenly we all laughed out loud, laughing at ourselves. It was clear that there were 12 of us, and we went back to the kitchen to start the game again. This time, it was my turn to be SME. Sarah found me while I hadn't yet chosen my hiding place. That round didn't last long. Quickly, all 12 people appeared and the game was over. Then the last guy to find me came up to me and told me that while everyone was running to the west side of the house and finding me, he went to the east side. In one of the bedrooms, there was a very large closet, and it seemed a good hiding place where I could have hidden myself. He opened the door in the dark and touched someone's hand. Then he asked in a whisper, "SME?" and got no answer. He thought he had found the hidden person. But later, hearing screams on the other side, he came out of the bedroom and saw that we were all in the opposite area of the house, and he was the last one. So, whose hand had he touched? We went back to the kitchen together to start another game of SME, and to reassure him, I told him that he must have imagined that he had touched someone, but it could have been any article of clothing. Although I was not calm either, and even I think nobody enjoyed the game anymore. However, none of them wanted to be the one who proposed to leave it and look like a coward. But all the fun was gone from the game. Why had Arthur counted 13 people instead of 12 on the stairs? And why had that boy touched someone in the closet when everyone was on the opposite side of the house? We all start a new game looking for SME. Several people who couldn't find the hidden person got together. So I decided to leave the main group and look for the closet that the boy had told me about. Arriving in the room, I collided with someone's knees. I reached out and touched a heavy, soft curtain. The curtains reached the floor. Someone was on the other side of the cloth, sitting by the window. I deduced that he had found SME, so I moved the curtain aside and touched a person's arm. The night was so dark that it didn't allow me to see her silhouette, so I asked SME and got no response. I stayed by her side waiting for the others to arrive. I asked her for a name, and she told me her name was Brenda. The name was unfamiliar to me, but I quickly associated it with the tall, dark-haired girl I'd noticed at dinner. Since no one came, I asked her a couple of ordinary questions, but she still didn't say anything to me. I already knew that in that game, the person who has to hide must be silent. There was no one there, nor could anyone be heard nearby. I started to feel a little annoyed and uncomfortable with her silence. I thought about it, thinking that maybe I hadn't made a good impression on her, and she was using the rules of the game to ignore me. Shortly after, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone on the other side of the curtain brushed against my knees. The curtain moved to one side, and a boy's hand touched my shoulder. He asked, "SME?" And of course, I didn't get an answer, so he sat next to me. The boy asked me if I was Peter, and in a very low voice, I said yes. Afterwards, he also asked me if I was SME, to which I replied with a negative. I told him that SME was the girl next to me. And just at that moment, the young woman came closer to me. I felt her very close, but she still didn't say a word. The boy who had just arrived said that he was already bored with the game. He would like to play something nicer and quieter, or even chat with Christmas stories by the fireplace. I admitted that I didn't feel comfortable either, and that I agreed with him in proposing another type of game to amuse us all. It had been quite some time before Arthur found us. He came into the room yelling our names. We came out from behind the window, and and Arthur asked us what had happened to us. They'd been waiting for us for over an hour and we were both disqualified. I complained that they hadn't found Smee yet, but he answered me by saying that we were the ones who hadn't found it. I was full of rage. It wasn't fair. Someone was cheating. I yelled at him that Smee was with us and that we hadn't lost. The boy who was with me supported me in all my words. Then Arthur turned on the light and moved the curtain. There was no one else there. My eyes couldn't be more open. I didn't understand anything. The boy who was with me looked at me surprised. I hadn't lied to him. I had really touched someone. Arthur turned off the light again and pretended nothing was wrong. He told us in a mocking voice that someone was having fun playing pranks that night, but I understood absolutely nothing. I had clearly felt someone's skin. We rejoined the rest of the group, and everyone snorted at how long we'd kept them waiting. Arthur told everyone that he had found us sitting behind a curtain, even suggesting that we were a couple, which pissed me off. The boy who had been waiting with me started looking at me in a strange way, as if he also thought I had made it up. So, tired of this damn game, I turned on the lights and walked over to the tall, dark-haired girl I'd noticed at dinner. I accused her in front of everyone of pretending to be Smee and then walking away. She, confused, shook her head, denying all my words. I was very pissed off. I wanted to go home. I was tired of that game. Then Arthur proposed to change our game altogether and have something else to do in the living room. The atmosphere had calmed down. We had all calmed down and we were laughing and having fun again. But soon after, Sarah came up to me, and she said to me she wanted to talk to me alone. She told me that she had not liked how I had spoken to and treated her friend, that they had been together the entire game, they had not been separated at any time, so she didn't like that I told lies. She told me that if I liked that boy, she had nothing to be ashamed of. Everyone supported me. However, it had been very selfish of me to have made them wait so long. Then, enraged, I yelled at her. I told her that we were not alone. There was someone else there, someone who had been pretending to be Smee and was tricking us. I pointed to her friend again and said, it was her, Brenda. She even told me her name while we were sitting. Sarah changed her expression and told me with a completely serious face, okay, Peter, I don't mind if you try to play a prank on me, but enough is enough. Brenda is the name of the girl who died in the basement of this house, the one who broke her neck on the stairs. Where have you heard that name?
It was cold and already dark when we parked the car full of boxes in our new house. An issue with the moving company made us arrive late and with the last lot of our things. But it didn't matter. It was our new house, finally. The former owner, a very decrepit old man, gave us only one condition. We were to move only after the new year. However, we thought that was a pretty strange condition, and we just imagined it was some sort of local superstition to start the new year with the right food. But even then, we couldn't wait any longer and decided to move just after signing the purchase papers. New Year's Eve was still 2 days away, and we wanted to spend them together in our new home. The house was old and a bit shabby, but for the price, we didn't care. Emma loved it. She fell in love with the house as soon as she saw it. It was from the start of the century, with 2 floors, white windows, and stone walls. A huge door guarded the entrance. It was made of solid oak and had a golden inscription that said 12 plus 1. We thought that was an ingenious way of naming the number 13, which, is the number for bad luck. When we entered, a gust of cold air engulfed us from top to bottom. It smelled like dust and dampness, but there was another smell filling the lounge, a metallic smell. We decided to light a few candles and settle in the living room. Between our boxes and an old rug, we improvised a bed. It had been a long day and we needed to rest. I was jolted awake when I felt a cold hand touching my cheek. I looked at Emma and she was still sleeping peacefully. That was very weird, but I stopped thinking about it and just went back to sleep. The next day, the house felt even colder and the sunlight wasn't enough to warm up the house. We started to clean around and unpack our boxes. Then we decided to go upstairs to keep exploring the house. And when we got to the entrance, we were petrified. Before us was a majestic set of stairs in the center of the lounge, flanked by strange paintings with images of virgins. The first ones were smiling, and as we went up, their expressions kept changing. First, they looked sad, then they were crying, and finally, they had an expression of pure horror. It wasn't until we got upstairs that we found ourselves face to face with a huge empty frame that occupied the entire wall, just where the stairs branched off. It was pretty big, and we thought it must have held a painting the previous owner took with him. We kept inspecting, and among worn-down tapestry and a dresser filled with dust and spider webs, we found a small silver necklace with a small crystal flask. It had dark, reddish spots inside, as if it had contained some sort of dust or clay. Emma loved it, and despite my reluctance, she decided to wear it. Who knew where that little flask came from? Or worse, what it contained? Nightfall came, and we decided to put on our best clothes to welcome the new year. I was using a purple velvet tuxedo that I stole from a theater, and Emma was using a beautiful gala dress. And that damn necklace. I was starting to feel uncomfortable. That thing really made me uneasy. She just laughed and mocked me for it, but I was still unsettled. 10 minutes before the chimes, someone rang the doorbell. How weird. Who could be at this hour? I opened the door, and it was... Emma? Suddenly, a scream behind me made me freeze in place. I turned around to see where it came from, and in that moment, I felt a stab on my back and I fell to the floor. What had just happened? Dragging myself, I tried to go up the stairs while calling Emma, but nobody responded. In its place, the paintings flanking the stairs were whispering. One by one, the images started coming out of the paintings, carrying daggers they would then stab me with. One dagger went into me per chime. Blood was spurting out of my wounds, and the pain was unbearable. With my last breath, I looked up, and I froze in fear. Emma was standing before me, with her eyes widened out and crying blood. The small flask, now filled with a reddish liquid, was now glowing, and her dress was no longer white. I screamed her name, but she didn't respond. Instead, she started to laugh. She laughed so hard that her jaw dislocated and blood started to pour out of it. The stairs were now painted in blood, and I lost consciousness. The next morning, I woke up at the hospital. Dazed, I asked where Emma was and what had happened. To my surprise, I was handcuffed to the bed, and a detective wouldn't stop asking me why I had killed her. I didn't understand what was going on. It was all so confusing. Me? Killing someone? The detective then showed me a very grotesque photo. In it, Emma was laying on the stairs, surrounded by a huge puddle of blood and with her throat slit. The flask was in the photo, and it was empty. However, what really left me without words was the huge frame on the stairs. That gaze, that smile. I just couldn't believe it.
Merry Christmas, TikTakers! Today is a very special day of joy, gifts, and sharing time with your family. However, did you think we were going to leave you without today's Scary Tuesday? No way! Here, we bring you an adaptation of a chilling tale, originally written by Tamiris Lupi. The story is about a very peculiar family and the way they celebrate Christmas. So pay attention! The first time you get to meet your girlfriend's family is an important event. One day, you might become part of our family, so you gotta give a good first impression. Be attentive, fun, and charming, but always in a natural and non-forced way. And overall, don't be nervous and make them feel like you are one of them. When I was 25 years old, I was sure that Laura was the woman of my life. She was intelligent, sweet, successful, and the most generous person I've ever met. We had been together for 2 years, and everything was perfect. Her family lived very far away, so I hadn't met them in person yet. I did get to know them through video calls, but you know that it isn't the same. Christmas Eve finally came. The big day. Her family spent the holidays here, staying in Laura's spacious and modern house where we were going to have our Christmas dinner. I arrived late because of work. I was worried about that, as the night was just getting started and I was already giving off a bad impression. However, Laura's father didn't care. He received me at the door with a big smile and a warm hug. I tried to apologize for being late, but he didn't care. He simply told me that work is work, and that is that. Now that I was seeing him in person, his appearance surprised me a lot. For a middle-aged man, he looked extraordinarily young and healthy. He was tall, handsome, and in good shape. I was about to discreetly ask him about his age, but he immediately took me to the dining room to meet in person the rest of the family. They were all very delightful and showered me with compliments. Laura's mom was very happy to see me and even gave me 2 kisses on the cheek. Her appearance surprised me even more than that of her husband. She didn't look like she was older than 30, and if you compared her with Laura side by side, you would think they were sisters. And the last one to greet me, who was less effusive but still kind, was their older son. He was a handsome young man, dressed elegantly as if he was a magazine model. His hair was perfectly combed and his teeth were sparkling white. Anybody would fall for him in an instant. I started to feel a bit strange and uncomfortable. Compared to that perfect postcard family, I was feeling like a bum who was being invited to their Christmas dinner out of charity. They surely looked 1,000 times better than in a video calls. But I suppose webcams don't make anyone look especially good. While Laura was getting ready, we sat down and started chatting to get to know each other better. I started thinking about how lucky I was for finding such a good-looking and interesting family, and eventually become part of it. I don't complain about my own family, not at all. I love my parents very much, but let's say they have a different style. Half an hour passed and Laura started coming downstairs. She looked gorgeous, more beautiful than ever. She looked like an angel coming down the stairs. This was all perfect, like a dream. Without thinking about it, I took a small box I had in my pocket and decided to go forward with the biggest step I had been thinking about taking for a while now. I knelt in front of her, showed her a ring in the box, and proposed to her in front of her family, who smiled out of surprise and excitement. Tears of joy escaped from her eyes, and she hugged me strongly. Her parents and brother also came closer to hug us and congratulate us. This was the perfect Christmas with the perfect family. Dinner time finally came, and we sat around the carefully set table. I preferred not to eat many appetizers, eagerly awaiting for the main dish. I was so hungry that when I saw Laura's dad and brother carrying out of the kitchen a huge tray covered with a metal cover, my mouth started watering. What was under there? I didn't ask and waited for them to take the cover off. For a few moments, I wasn't sure about which animal's roasted meat was in the tray, which looked pretty good along with a fine garnish. Then, I took a closer look at the shape of the cut-off limbs, and I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. It can't be, it must be my imagination, but it looked like a finely cooked human body. The eyes of the rest of the family were shining, and they congratulated Laura and her mother for being such good cooks. I could hardly speak, but I managed to say, But is this... Laura confirmed what I was suspecting, as if it were the most natural and normal thing in the world. They even started talking about how to prepare it, which spices to use, and the oven's temperature, while they served pieces of legs, thorax, and arms. I discreetly looked at the head, and I could notice it belonged to a young teen. But the most terrifying part was not seeing them eat a roasted human. It was a strange sensation that with each bite they had, their skin seemed to become shinier, and their aura of elegance increased. Laura's father gave me a pat on the back, encouraging me to eat. Come on, boy, you can't be eternally young and handsome without, a little sacrifice, and it's only once a year. he told me while he gave a bite to what looked like a humerus. The situation seemed so natural and their explanations were so convincing that I started to reconsider. Laura took my hand, looked at me in the eyes, and with the sweetest of smiles asked me, "Do you actually love me? Don't you want to be like us and spend the rest of your life with me?" I didn't answer. I served a piece of leg on my plate and stubbed it with my fork. I closed my eyes, opened my mouth, and determined to take the next step, I said, "I do." It was Christmas Eve once again, and Marco's parents couldn't stop thinking about the letter that their son had left for them to read. A year had passed since little Marcos wrote it. Christmas was a miserable time for them all, as all those horrible memories from that fateful night would come flooding back. Dear family, friends, and strangers who might be reading this, I need you all to know my story. Many of you might think that I've turned completely insane, and I honestly wish that was true and that everything was just a product of my imagination. I'm sure that all of you know who Santa Claus is. Many call him that, others call him St. Nicholas or Father Christmas. Doesn't really matter. We all know that chubby mister who leaves presents in our houses on the night of the 24th of December. But let me ask you, have any of you actually seen him? Thousands of millions of kids in the world, and you tell me that nobody has ever seen him in person? Many believe they have the answer, but they're all wrong. I can assure you that none of you actually know him. Christmas was my favorite time of the year, and we would always celebrate it at my house with all the family. After the Christmas Eve dinner, my cousin Juan and my aunt Anna would spend the night with us so we could all open the presents together the next day. Juan would sleep with me, and the adults would always tell us, "You gotta go to sleep soon. If you don't, Santa will not leave you presents. Children need to be sleeping for Santa to be able to come in." And I would think, that's so stupid. What difference would it make if I get to see him? If I did, I could thank him for all the presents he had given me throughout the years. But that last year, I would have preferred a video game console instead of socks and boxers. Now, Juan and I had other plans. That night, we would wake up in the middle of the night while everyone else was asleep, and we would be the only kids in the world to see Santa face to face. 3 a.m. came, and all we could hear were the snores of my father. We tiptoed to make as little noise as possible. We were also carrying our bed sheets, just in case. We hid behind the couch, and we waited. And since nothing was happening yet, we grabbed and ate some of the leftover chocolate candies from dinner. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise coming from the chimney. We weren't sure if we should come out of our hiding place or not. What if it was true that if he saw us, he wouldn't leave our presents? And so we remained hidden. Shortly after, we saw feet landing inside the fireplace. Oh man, I was so nervous. I was about to see Santa himself. I peeked a bit to see him better. Santa was facing away from us, carrying his huge sack of presents. However, we noticed something strange. Some sort of red and slimy liquid was oozing out of the sack. And then Juan forcefully grabbed my arm and whispered to me, "Marcus, we have to get out of here. I think this is dangerous." Suddenly, Santa turned around and saw us. He didn't have the face of a nice old man that we all imagine. Instead, his eyes were huge and completely black. Juan peed his pants, and I was struggling to not do the same thing. "Do not scream unless you want to end up like them," said Santa in a terrifying voice. He opened his sack, and I found out what that red liquid actually was: blood. The sack was filled with children corpses, their organs and intestines pouring out of their dead bodies. The living room now had a huge puddle of blood in the middle of it. Juan couldn't avoid screaming. I tried to shut him up by covering his mouth, but he was completely out of it.
He was screaming like crazy, as if he was having a panic attack. Santa then approached him, and I couldn't watch. I closed my eyes shut and covered my ears. I still didn't scream. In my head, I repeated, "Mom, Dad, please help me." But nobody came. And when I opened my eyes, Santa and Juan were no longer there. My parents came, turned on the lights, and found a living room filled with blood and a knife in the middle. We never saw Juan again. He disappeared forever. My Aunt Anna still hates me to this day, since she never believed me when I said that Santa killed him. I was also locked into a psychiatric institution because nobody believed me. And now, all I know is that you should never get out of bed on Christmas night.
The entire Miller family was in the living room of the house laughing and toasting. It was Christmas Eve and they celebrated affection, love, and togetherness. Everyone except Owen, who considered that those parties were nothing more than a consumer invention. He was 14 years old and had lost all the Christmas spirit. His aunt and uncle, Mary and Dan, had driven 5 hours to spend the holidays together and had brought the drinks. The mother had prepared a delicious roast, the father had decorated the room with ornaments, and the grandmother had prepared homemade sweets. Everyone had contributed something to the celebration. However, the young man had only stuck to sitting at the table with a bad face, waiting for the time to go to sleep. The oven bell rang. The gingerbread cookies were ready, and Grandma asked Owen to take them out of the oven and decorate them, so they would have them ready the next day for breakfast. Owen snorted and rolled his eyes. Why did he have to? His mother looked at him, raising her eyebrows, and he quickly knew that it was not an offer, but an order. He carefully removed the cookies from the oven. His grandmother had left the mixtures with colors to decorate in several bowls. Then he began to speak out loud. "I hate Christmas. I hate these useless gingerbread cookies. I hate Christmas carols and the star decorations all over the house." While cursing all Christmas customs, he was decorating the pastries with evil and devilish faces. He told his grandmother that they were already decorated. The dough just needed to cool overnight and they would be ready to eat. He laughed to himself, thinking of the horror on the old woman's face when she saw them. They all said goodnight and went to sleep. The house was silent, waiting for the arrival of Santa Claus and his gifts for the family. However, the one who slipped through the Miller's chimney was not the good-natured one that everyone expected, but Krampus did. He walked over to the kitchen, and when he saw the gingerbread cookies, he had an idea. He passed his hand over them and went to other houses to scare the children. Seconds later, the decorated mass began to move. Krampus had given them life. The cookies spilled out of the tray and they began to get into mischief. They dumped the food they found, emptied the shelves, and even tossed the glass bottles to the ground, breaking them into hundreds of pieces. The noise of glass woke up Owen, who, believing that he would finally find Santa Claus in his house, ran downstairs. When he got to the kitchen, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It could be that a thief had broken in if it weren't for the fact that nothing had been taken. Everything was lying on the ground. Then he approached the Christmas tree and he realized that there were no gifts under it. Santa Claus hadn't yet arrived. As he was leaving, he looked at the tree again. There were gingerbread cookie decorations. He grabbed one in his hand, and they were the cookies he had decorated. Suddenly, the gingerbread cookie bit his finger and Owen threw it to the ground. The rest of the cookies jumped from the tree and climbed up his feet, biting his legs. The young man didn't understand what was happening. He kicked at the air and tried to get rid of them. The cookies could not stop laughing as they attacked him. They grabbed the electric stapler Owen's father had used for the decorations and began driving staples through the body. The child was screaming, although none of his relatives came down to help him. The cookies managed to make him fall. He couldn't get up. His clothes had been stapled to the floor. He was trapped. One of the pastas grabbed a pair of scissors and walked straight to cut him in the face. But suddenly, the family dog took a bite of the cookie, and then all the others. Owen breathed easy. That nightmare was over.
He managed to free one arm and patted the pet on the head. However, something had changed forever in his dog.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!